Pope Benedict XVI has said that dialogue can lead to the error of relativism. Pope Francis and Pope Leo XIV, on the other hand, have put dialogue at the center of the Church's mission. So, which one is it? Surprisingly, the answer may lie in a very overlooked image from Pope Francis's theology. And that's what we're going to explore in today's video. Hello, everyone, and welcome back. As you all know, one of the hallmarks of Benedict XVI's papacy was his warnings against the dictatorship of relativism, a position defined by the concepts of tolerance and knowledge through dialogue and freedom, concepts which would be limited if the existence of one valid truth for all were affirmed. Many Catholics, myself included, were shaped by these warnings. We were told, and rightly so, that defending truth is one essential part of our Catholic faith. But during the papacy of Francis, and even now with Leo XIV, the Church seems to have grown more comfortable with the concepts of pluralism, dialogue, and diversity. And for some Catholics, this raised the obvious concern. Has the relativism that Benedict so warned against somehow infiltrated the Church herself? And that concern seems also to be at the heart of those Catholics' distrust for synodality, which is the apple of the eye of Pope Francis and which Pope Leo is trying to continue. But is this really what is happening? To answer this question, let us take as our basis the great speech against relativism that Cardinal Joseph Ratzinger, future Benedict XVI, offered in Latin America. According to relativism, we can never grasp ultimate truth in itself, but only its appearance in our way of perceiving through different lenses. What we grasp is not really and properly reality in itself, but a reflection on our scale. Now, compare that with what Pope Leo wrote in his recent encyclical Magnificat Humanitas. In this way, the truth of the gospel is not imposed from above, but grows over time within the concrete interweaving of lives, communities, and cultures. This is not a truth that fears diversity, but instead welcomes and guides it. This concept can also be illustrated by the image of a multifaceted polyhedron, in which the one truth of the gospel is reflected from different angles. So, are these two ideas contradictory, or is there a way to reconcile them? As I explained on my video on modernism, the Church tends to move through two different stages, alternating between them. First, when an error starts to take hold of the world, the Church rightly recognizes that error as something that needs to be confronted in the name of truth. And so the Church takes a strong stance against that error. That strong position inevitably draws boundaries. It draws clear lines on the sand that cannot ever be crossed. And through this process, the Church clarifies exactly what she believes in, what is compatible with her, and what is not. But once the dust has settled and the boundaries have been clearly set, the church gradually becomes more comfortable to explore all the territory that is available within those boundaries. She can then start looking at the other side and thinking if there is anything good that can still be salvaged and incorporated while still not crossing the boundaries that have been clearly set. But then here's the danger. Catholics who took the Church's warning seriously during the clarification stage may develop a kind of monomania. They rightly try to address the error, but then they become so focused on correcting it that fighting against the error becomes the entirety of their faith, their sole focus. So when the church enters the exploration phase, they see that exploration as capitulation. They think that the church has surrendered to that error that they spent so many years fighting against. And they reason like this. I am doing what I have always have done. I am fighting the error just as I always did. If I was not wrong then, how can I be wrong now for doing the exact same thing? But they are not doing what they have always done because supposedly they have been fighting against the error. And the church has not entered into erroneous territory. The church has not crossed the boundaries that she herself set. Rather, she is exploring, but maybe exploring territory that may be closer to the boundary than what those Catholics are comfortable with. And since those Catholics have turned the fight against that error in the entirety of their faith, they may start losing perspective and nuance. And then they become unable to recognize the difference between the error and something that they think is the error because they think it resembles it. Because they believe that the church has succumbed into error, but they haven't. So they have become what the church should do. And then it becomes incumbent upon them, so they think, to save the church or to fight against the error by fighting the church. And by doing this, they end up sacrificing what is keeping them safe, their unity with the church that contains the fullness of truth and that enjoins divine assistance in order not to fall into error, which are things that those Catholics do not necessarily possess. So let us look at a concrete example that is relevant to the topic at hand. In 2019, Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar, Ahmed Al-Taib, one of the leading authorities in the Sunni Muslim world, have signed a joint declaration on human fraternity. And almost immediately, some of the critics of Pope Francis have objected to this passage. The pluralism and the diversity of religions, color, sex, race, and language are willed by God in His wisdom, through which He created human beings. The criticism was that Pope Francis was promoting religious indifferentism by saying that God had willed a plurality of religions. But look closely. That's not what the sentence is saying. The document does not say that God willed a plurality and diversity of religions, but that God willed a pluralism and diversity of religions. And those are not the same thing. There is a difference between talking about a diversity of religions from the standpoint of a plurality, as in meaning many religions, and talking about diversity of religions from a perspective of pluralism, meaning that several religions coexist peacefully in the same society. And this second interpretation is actually the most appropriate one for this document because this was not a theological statement. It was a document meant, as the title itself says, to strengthen the fraternity and cooperation between members of two different religions. And this is why nuance matters. These two very similar words have completely different meanings, one being erroneous and the other being perfectly compatible with what the church teaches. Nuance helps us to not be scandalized by shallow readings of things that are merely appearances of contradiction. So now we have to ask ourselves, is there a similar nuance that distinguishes between Ratzinger's erroneous relativistic lenses and Leo's polyhedron? I found it really funny when I saw people reading and reacting to Magnifica Humanitas and then praising Pope Leo for this polyhedron metaphor because they thought that Leo has a mathematical degree, so he came up with it himself. But that's not where that image comes from. Pope Leo did not come up with the polyhedron metaphor because of his mathematical inclinations. Rather, he was explicitly citing an image that Pope Francis used repeatedly throughout his pontificate. And honestly, the fact that this image has never caught on, so much that people cannot even recognize it, is a bit sad because it is so insightful and interesting. Let us look at Leo's quotation in the broader context of the sentence. Leo was talking about truth, the same topic that was so dear to Benedict, and he talks about it in these terms. Understanding that the truth is a gift to be shared, not a possession to be monopolized, frees the church from the temptation of seeking forms of presence based on power. I too have reaffirmed that the church does not claim to possess a monopoly on truth. And at first glance, this statement seems to contradict the Catholic belief that the church possesses the fullness of truth, and so it would be relativism. But let's see what Leo really intends. He continues by saying, the church does not claim to possess a monopoly on truth because truth is not a territory to be defended, but a good to be shared. For his part, Pope Francis expressed the same perspective in his striking phrase, time is greater than space. What matters most is not occupying positions of power or defending cultural strongholds, but initiating good processes and enabling them to mature. In other words, Pope Leo is not talking about monopoly on truth, as in the fullness of truth that the church possesses. He is talking about monopoly of truth in terms of a language of power that is imposed on others. And he does so in the terms of Pope Francis' phrase, time is greater than space. Precisely the terms that we explored in my previous video, so please feel free to check it out. Remember that time is greater than space was one of the four principles that Pope Francis laid out in Evangelii Gaudium. And also remember that at the beginning of his pontificate, Pope Leo mentioned that there would be two major guidelines for his pontificate: the Second Vatican Council and Evangelii Gaudium. And so it's in this paragraph that Pope Leo eventually talks about the Polyhedron. And this is significant because the first time that Pope Francis mentioned this image of the polyhedron was precisely in Evangelii Gaudium. And when Pope Leo mentions the polyhedron, there is a footnote there which directs us precisely to Evangelii Gaudium. And once we begin to flesh out this image of the polyhedron as Francis intended it, then we can start seeing the differences and nuances that separates it from the relativism that Benedict so rightly warned us against. Remember, as we have already seen, when Cardinal Ratzinger warned us against relativism, it did so by saying that relativism claims that we can never grasp truth in itself, only appearances of truth, as we were seeing it through different lenses. But when Pope Francis first introduces the polyhedron in Evangelii Gaudium, he does so in the context of another of those four great principles from that document. The whole is greater than the parts. The different faces of the polyhedron are not like lenses through which we can peek at a hidden truth inside it, albeit with each lens distorting that underlying truth in a different way. Instead, since the whole is greater than the parts, each face of the polyhedron is a real and essential part of the whole, and that whole is truth. A relativist would look at the different faces of the polyhedron and conclude that truth cannot ever be known. But Leo, in Magnifica Humanitas, explicitly says that the one truth of the gospel is reflected on the many sides of the polyhedron. Benedict talks about relativism in terms of lenses. Leo talks about the polyhedron as reflections, or, if you will, mirrors. One of them looks inward, the other reflects things outward. As Francis himself puts it, validating Leo, in this way, the gospel becomes incarnate and finds harmonious expressions in different ways in different people's lives, like a single melody that recurs in various tonalities. To make this easier to understand, let us use a different analogy. Let us think about the famous story of the elephant and the blindfolded man that appears in several Buddhist and Hindu texts. So, a group of blindfolded men is brought before an elephant and asked to figure out what it is. So one of the men touches the elephant's trunk and says that it's a snake. Another man touches the elephant's ears and says it's a fan. Another touches the elephant's leg and says it's a pillar. Another touches the elephant's side and says it's a wall. You get the idea. According to relativist philosophy, each of these men would be incapable of ever figuring out that this was an elephant in front of them because they would be completely incapable of ever apprehending what an elephant even is. The relativists may go even further and say that each of the blindfolded men is right. The elephant is a snake, and at the same time, he is two hand fans and four pillars and a wall. It is whatever the men say it is. But if we think about the elephant as a polyhedron, as Francis and Leo envisions it, then we can say something completely different. We know that this is an elephant, and that is the truth. But it's an elephant that is composed of several parts, and each one has its own importance. So the elephant uses its trunk to grab things. It uses the ears to hear and to cool itself. It uses the legs to walk, and it uses the torso to support itself and its vital organs. And yet, this elephant is much more than merely a pile of chopped up parts. It is not just a trunk and two ears and four legs and a torso. It is that, of course. But when you combine all those parts into a harmonious whole, you have something more. You have an elephant. The whole is greater than the sum of its parts. And that actually reminds me of that image of St. Paul that the body of Christ is made of different members, each with its own purpose. You have the eye, you have the hand, etc. But the anti-relativist may actually go into the opposite extreme. He may claim that just because all of these blindfolded men cannot ever agree on what the elephant is, then the answer will lie in cutting off every part of the elephant that may seem different. For example, he might cut off its trunk because the trunk is so different from every other single part of its body. So it must not belong. It must be removed in order to arrive at the greatest truth of what the elephant truly is. It doesn't matter to the anti-relativist that the trunk is precisely one of the most distinctive features that makes the elephant what it is, precisely because it is so different from everything else. For the anti-relativist, only one thing exists: the whole. And that whole cannot have any different parts because it must be completely homogeneous without any differences whatsoever. The result would be to turn the elephant, and in fact everything else, into a sphere. But that cannot be because an elephant, by definition, is not a sphere. Just like a polyhedron is not a sphere. And in fact, Francis explicitly mentions that the opposite of the polyhedron is precisely the sphere. Here, our model is not the sphere, which is no greater than its parts, where every point is equidistant from the center, and there are no differences between them. Instead, it is the polyhedron, which reflects the convergence of all its parts, each of which preserves its distinctiveness. If you're enjoying this video so far, please leave a like and subscribe so that you'll help this channel grow. Thank you for all your support. And now back to the video. When Ratzinger warned against relativism, he was concerned with what he explicitly called an attenuation of Christology. This attenuation, he argued, could come about also through a fascination with East Asian religions, which contain a negative theology that fits very well with this particular brand of Western relativism that we have been discussing. And that image of the elephant and the blindfolded man that appear in Buddhist and Hindu texts also is a very good example of this kind of negative relativistic theology. But Francis's Polyhedron explicitly rejects this kind of thinking. When he is discussing the principle that the whole is greater than the parts, Francis warns us against two extremes that we must avoid. One of them is people get caught up in an abstract, globalized universe, falling into step behind everyone else, admiring the glitter of other people's world, gaping and applauding at all the right times. And Francis is even more explicit and forceful in the paragraph that follows. And this is very interesting because his critics were constantly saying that Francis was sacrificing tradition and our Christian roots precisely to advance a kind of syncretism in which all truths are equally valid. But this is actually the opposite of what Francis is saying. We constantly have to broaden our horizons and see the greater good which will benefit us all. But this has to be done without evasion or uprooting. We need to sink our roots deeper into the fertile soil and history of our native place, which is a gift of God. Francis makes a very similar point in his seminal encyclical Fratelli Tutti. A love capable of transcending borders is the basis of what in every city and country can be called social friendship. Now, genuine social friendship within a society makes true universal openness possible. This is a far cry from the false universalism of those who constantly travel abroad because they cannot tolerate or love their own people. There can be a false openness to the universal, born of the shallowness of those lacking insight into the genius of their native land, or harboring unresolved resentment towards their own people. There is a very concrete example of this in Francis's exhortation, Querida Amazonia, which followed the Synod on the Amazon. And in this document, Francis has a whole chapter called the Amazonian Polyhedron. There he explains that each of the peoples that is currently living in the Amazonian region possesses their own cultural identity and particular richness in our multicultural world. The lifestyles and worldviews of each of these peoples is different, is not the same, and that's actually the point. In each land and its features, God manifests himself and reflects something of his inexhaustible beauty. Immediately afterwards, Pope Francis moves to the next section titled Caring for the Roots. And here, Pope Francis warns us how Consumerism, individualism, and globalism are destroying this diversity, which should enrich our world because they are trying to make everything homogeneous. Young people, dazzled by the modern lifestyle, may start despising their own roots and they stop listening to their elders. And in that process, they break the chain of oral tradition, of storytelling, and transmitted wisdom that has lasted for centuries. In another section, Pope Francis laments how socioeconomic circumstances may force indigenous peoples to migrate into the cities, and there they become uprooted from their communities, and therefore they lose contact with their own cultural distinctiveness, which then becomes lost in the homogeneity of urban life. Francis confirms this point in Fratelli Tutti, where he explains that imposing uniformity from above may counterintuitively actually not help oppose relativism, but may actually reinforce it. If someone tells young people to ignore their history, to reject the experiences of their elders, to look down on the past, and to look forward to a future that he himself holds out, doesn't it then become easy to draw them along so that they only do what he tells them? He needs the young to be shallow, uprooted, and distrustful so that they can trust only in his promises and act according to his plans. That is how various ideologies operate. They destroy or deconstruct all differences so that they can reign unopposed. To do so, however, they need young people who have no use for history, who spurn the spiritual and human riches inherited from past generations, and are ignorant of everything that came before them. Unless someone objects that Pope Francis is only talking about pagan and indigenous peoples and not about Christianity because supposedly such a liberal, let us remember that in the section where Pope Francis talks about caring for the roots, he explicitly mentions Christian roots. As he says, for those of them who are baptized, these roots include the history of the people of Israel and the church up to our own day. And in Evangelii Gaudium, to Christians, this principle also evokes the totality or integrity of the gospel which the church passes down to us and sends us forth to proclaim. Its fullness and richness embrace scholars and workers, businessmen and artists, in a word, everyone. The genius of each people receives in its own way the entire gospel and embodies it in expressions of prayer, fraternity, justice, struggle, and celebration. The gospel has an intrinsic principle of totality. It will always remain good news until it has been proclaimed to all people, until it has healed and strengthened every aspect of humanity, until it has brought all men and women together at the table in God's kingdom. The whole is greater than the parts. Francis and Leo are very keen on dialogue. But some Catholics are weary of dialogue precisely because they think that it can water down our Christian roots. In his speech on relativism, Cardinal Ratzinger does indeed warn that dialogue can be used to foster relativism when it is done in the wrong way. He says, on the other hand, the notion of dialogue, which has maintained a position of significant importance in the Platonic and Christian tradition, changes meaning and becomes both the quintessence of the relativist creed and the antithesis of conversion and mission. In the relativist meaning, to dialogue means to put one's own position or one's faith on the same level as the convictions of others, without recognizing in principle more truth in it than that which is attributed to the opinion of the other. Only if I suppose in principle that the other can be as right or more right than I, can an authentic dialogue take place. According to this concept, dialogue must be an exchange between positions which have fundamentally the same rank and therefore are mutually exclusive. Only in this way will the maximum cooperation and integration between the different religions be achieved. At first glance, this might seem a bit damning to Francis's and Leo's position, but if you continue reading the same paragraph, you get an idea of what Benedict is really on about. He says, the relativist dissolution of Christology and even more of ecclesiology thus becomes a central commandment of religion. To return to Hicks' thinking, faith in the divinity of one concrete person, as he tells us, leads to fanaticism and particularism, to the dissociation between faith and love, and it is precisely that which must be overcome. And this is completely different from Francis's notion of dialogue from the perspective of caring for one's roots. For you see, for Francis, caring for one's own roots is not only important in itself, it is important for dialogue. Without caring for one's roots, dialogue is not possible. The solution is not an openness that spurns its own richness. Just as there can be no dialogue with others without a sense of our own identity, so there can be no openness between peoples except on the basis of love for one's own land, one's own people, one's own cultural roots. I cannot truly encounter another unless I stand on firm foundations. For it is on the basis of these that I can accept the gift the other brings, and in turn offer an authentic gift of my own. I can welcome others who are different and value the unique contribution they have to make only if I am firmly rooted in my own people and culture. In other words, dialogue only works if each side has a firm understanding of who they are. Otherwise, what are they dialoguing about? What positions are they bringing to the conversation? That would not be a dialogue. That would be a monologue between two people with the same position, or between a person with a position and someone with no position at all that just nods along as he goes. That's not dialogue. Dialogue does not mean giving up or watering down our own position. It means standing firmly rooted in our own position while remaining open to be enriched by the contribution and the perspective of the other. We see this again in Querida Amazonia. Identity and dialogue are not enemies. Our own cultural identity is strengthened and enriched as a result of dialogue with those unlike ourselves. In summary, Benedict opposed relativism because it dissolves the boundaries between different positions, and namely the boundaries between Christianity and other religions. But what Francis and Leo are asking is not to dissolve boundaries. They explicitly state that those boundaries must remain in place. What they are saying is that those boundaries are not to be hermetically sealed. They are porous and they allow elements of each position to cross through and enrich both different positions even while they remain separate by the boundaries. And we need not be afraid that those new elements are going to dissolve our own identity because we ourselves are going to integrate those new elements according to that cultural identity. As Francis explains, a living culture enriched by elements from other places, does not import a mere carbon copy of those new elements, but integrates them in its own unique way. The result is a new synthesis that is ultimately beneficial to all, since the original culture itself ends up being nourished. And so, even with this exchange of elements, our cultural identity remains the same because the boundaries are still there. And this is completely different from what Benedict was warning us against. For Benedict, the danger was the dissolution of the boundaries because if we dissolve the boundaries, both positions eventually become homogeneous. In other words, a sphere. And a sphere is precisely the opposite of the polyhedron that Francis envisions. But then we may ask, why risk putting our identity in danger through dialogue in the first place? Wouldn't it be safest if we believe that we're holding to something sacred and that does not belong to us but was transmitted to us from above to just keep it separate and untouched, lest it be profaned or polluted? Remember earlier when Pope Francis was discussing his principle, the whole is greater than the parts, he warned against two extremes. One extreme was a completely globalized and abstract mentality that just accepts and applauds everything that comes from the outside. But then there is the opposite extreme that we must be also weary of. At the other extreme, they turn into a museum of local folklore, a world apart, doomed to doing the same thing over and over and incapable of being challenged by novelty or appreciating the beauty which God bestows beyond their borders. And Pope Francis talked a great deal about this throughout his pontificate. He warned against Catholics just turning their tradition into a museum, like putting it behind a glass wall as if for an exhibit, so that it does not get touched, so that people just admire it from afar. Instead, Francis preferred the image of tradition as a tree. A tree does indeed grow, develops, and gives fruits, but it also has roots. In order to prevent this process of human impoverishment, there is a need to care lovingly for our roots, since they are a fixed point from which we can grow and meet new challenges. And since we have our roots, and since we must take care of our roots, then we need not fear dialogue. We have a fixed point from which we can grow. And we must dialogue because doing otherwise would, as we have seen, significantly impoverish the church. We are a Catholic church, a universal church. We believe that God scattered elements of goodness throughout all the world, and we are called to assimilate those good elements and reflect everything good that God has given to the world, wherever it may be. If we fail to do so, the church becomes impoverished because it no longer has access to that element of goodness that is also a reflection of the truth that comes from God. And in any way, trying to wall off the church from every external element is not possible, no matter how much you fight it. Because, yes, it is true, the church is divine, and so it has eternal truths that can never change. But on the other hand, she is also human. She is incarnated in time. And as we have seen in my last video, and time is greater than space, being in time is necessarily to change. The church is bound to change her human elements, regardless of whether you try to stop it or not. The church has indeed been assimilating the good elements of all the culture she encounters throughout her evangelization mission. She has been doing this for millennia. That's tradition. A culture can grow barren when it becomes inward looking and tries to perpetuate obsolete ways of living by rejecting any exchange or debate with regard to the truth about man. That would be unrealistic, since it is not easy to protect oneself from cultural invasion. For this reason, interest and concern for the cultural values of the indigenous groups should be shared by everyone, for their richness is also our own. And this explains something that Francis continuously warned the church against. He told the church to not be what he called self-referential. Instead, he and now Leo have called for a church in exit, a church that goes forth. Because it is only by going forth outside of our own walls that the church can bring the gospel to the whole world and thus fulfill her mission. But to do that, the church inevitably needs to dialogue. And surely, not the relativistic dialogue that some people in the world and even some people within the church would want, but rather a genuine dialogue, firmly rooted in the identities of each party. But this is not easy. It takes time. And even though time is greater than space, as we have seen in my previous video, in the immediate, it is much easier to just carve our own little space and sit comfortably in it. But the path that the contemporary church asks us to do is much more challenging. The polyhedron is not a straightforward geometric figure. Unlike the sphere, which is smooth and easy to handle, it is angular and also sharp. It has an edge, as reality itself can have at times. Yet, this complexity is at the basis of its beauty, since it allows the figure to reflect light with different tones and gradations, depending on the angle of each facet. One facet casts a definable light, another more muted, and yet another a chiaroscuro. Not only that, but with its multiple sides, a polyhedron can also produce a variety of shades. Having a polyhedric vision, then, implies training our eyes to grasp and appreciate all these nuances. And yes, this means entering into dialogue with people that we believe to be in error, which is something that some radical traditionalists take issue with. Benedict does tell us that charity or love only exists in truth, caritas in veritate. But Francis is not telling us to sacrifice truth. In fact, as we have seen, he tells us the opposite. But what he is telling us is that just like charity and love only exist in truth, truth is only efficacious if it is shared in charity and love. Veritas in caritate. As Francis teaches us, not only that, but with its multiple sides, a polyhedron can also produce a variety of shades. As all these images suggest, the work of education is a true mission in which individuals and situations are accepted with all their lights and shadows, their shadows too, with a kind of parental love. And this facilitates in a unique way the growth of those seeds that God has sown within each person. Each person must be accompanied as he or she is. And that is the starting point of all dialogue, journey, and progress. So, our challenge is to follow this church that goes forth and that shares truth to the world, not as if she has a monopoly on it, as if it were a language of power to be imposed on others, but through a patient process of dialogue. And we need not be afraid that this will lead to relativism because Benedict already laid out the groundwork of explaining which lines should not be crossed. But on the other hand, we should not impose boundaries beyond the ones that Benedict laid out because we have become so focused on fighting against the era of relativism that we lost all nuance. Rather, we should pursue dialogue, which is not relativistic because it is a dialogue shaped by the model of the polyhedron. And again, we should not be afraid of this process because we have faith that we are in a church that receives divine assistance in order not to fall into error. So we need not be afraid of anything as long as we remain united with this church. I will leave links in the video description below to all of the papal documents and interventions that I mentioned throughout this video, as well as links to my other videos that I mentioned here, and also a link to my personal website, pedrogabrielwriter.com, where you can learn more about my books and articles. Also, if you enjoyed this video, please leave a like and subscribe so that you'll always be updated whenever a new video is released. That's all for today. God bless. Let us engage in dialogue without falling into relativism, and see you soon.